You hear me? Yes. Thank you so much for joining us today for our very, very first Art in Flux Live. It's our premiere today. And before I talk you through today's program and introduce the speakers, let me just tell you a couple of words about myself. My name is Oliver Gingrich. I am an artist myself, a co-founder and curator here at Art in Flux, and also part of the art collective Analema Group. And you'll hear a lot more about Analema Group later on by my colleague Evgenia Emets, who is one of the speakers for today. My own research and my own practice is really centered about concepts of presence. I work a lot with holographic projections, with light installations, and with this concept of participatory art forms. Yeah, today I'm here as your curator for our Art in Flux Live and the event New Heritage, our very first event of Flux Live. The event today is going to feature a great array of discussions, and what we'll do is we will have a quick introduction about Art in Flux first, and then I will talk you through the event. A couple of housekeeping rules before we get started. There is in active speaker mode, which is the second icon in your Zoom window, so the second one to select. This is probably the most comfortable viewing experience for you because it allows you to focus on the speaker and not see everybody at the same time. We'll have a roundtable with Q&As afterwards, so any questions that you might have, you don't need to save them. You can just literally put them, drop them into the chat. We will monitor the chat and take a record of any questions for the roundtable sections. And before we get started with the event, let me hand over to my colleague Francesca, who is going to tell you a bit about the history of Art in Flux and what we do.
Hi, thank you, Oliver. So pleased to be here. Really looking forward to this evening's event. My name is Afra Shemza. For those of you that don't know me, I'm a multimedia artist. I work with light, abstraction and interactivity. So you can see some images of my work there. I'm one of the Flux curators and also the founder of one of the founders of Art in Flux, along with Maria Almina and Oliver Gingrich. So just to give you a little bit of an introduction about us, Flux was founded in 2016 by us three artists, and we really felt like there was the home missing for multimedia artists basically in the UK, and we wanted to create a group where we could come together, meet other like-minded artists and kind of share our ideas and kind of collaborate. So we created Flux. We were founded in 2016 and we decided to run a number of different types of events. So our Flux socials feature all these many different artists where we can come together and profile our work internally. And so the artists get to speak about their practice and get some valuable feedback and kind of dialogue about their practice. We also curate talks throughout the year, and these are generally around the artist founders' research interests. Maria will tell you a little bit more about the ones that we're doing this year with the National Gallery X. And we also want to provide a platform really for our artists to showcase their work to the public. And so we do this as well through our exhibition program, where we do yearly exhibitions, where we have interactive installations, VR pieces, augmented reality, all kinds of techie, amazing things to explore. And one of the other things that we've really been trying to do is to create a series of workshops where we can bring the art and technology world to not just to the public, but also to local community groups. So you can see here a workshop that Stuart Batchelor did at the V&A, which was brilliant. And finally, just for my introductions, we also have one of the things that we really wanted to do with Flux was not only to provide a platform for artists and the public, but also for artists working with multimedia and institutions. So we've been able to work with the V&A, the National Gallery, the Royal College of Art, and also many academic partners as well, like Goldsmiths and EVA London. So I'll hand over to Maria, who talked to you a little bit about our Flux virtual offering. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Afra. I am truly delighted to be launching Flux Live today. Really looking forward to what Oliver Gingrich have curated for us. I'm sure it's going to be inspirational. My name is Maria Almena. I'm also one of the co-founders at Art in Flux, as well as a curator. I'm also a multidisciplinary artist, and I'm the director of the studio Kimatica, where we explore the intersection between interactive technology, human form, and the live performance in order to create transcendental immersive experiences to connect the audiences with the ethereal world. You can see some of the images of my work in the slide. So yeah, this year, as have happened to many of us, we had to move all our live program to a virtual format. Since March this year, we've moved all our Flux socials to a virtual program. And since then, we've done like once a month. This is one of our key events for Art in Flux, because that's where like all our art community and artists come together, and we discuss different topics that we feel are relevant in this particular moment. We offer support and change of idea, and we facilitate collaboration, and we facilitate help as much as we can. So we then also the next type of events here, our Flux Live, which this is the first event that Oliver have curated. Both of events and our whole virtual program has been supported by the Arts Council, which we've been very grateful to have this support, so we could continue to be connected with our community and our audience. And the other type of event we're going to have this 2020 is the Curator Talks. As Afra said, this year we've been very honored to have our residency for the Curator Talks at the National Gallery X. And Oliver Gingrich have already done his first event. It was last month around gender. The next event is going to be in September, curated by myself, around well-being and new media arts. And in November, we're going to have Afra Shemma curating one about cultural heritage. So keep an eye for all of those. You can always be, if you join our newsletter, you'll be updated and invited to all of these events. And now I would love to pass it to Oliver Gingrich, so he can delight us with a wonderful program he have for all of us. Enjoy.
Thank you so much, Afra and Maria. Yeah, so today we'll be discussing new heritage. So these changing conceptions of heritage that we're currently experiencing. Heritage not necessarily being something that is classic, historic, antiquated, but something that's very much alive, contemporary, actual, and happening right here. And especially now, where we're all experiencing new challenges with accessibility, we really feel that new media can play a role in the discussion around heritage, and how we can all, as media artists, contribute to infusing these heritage experiences with new possibilities of experiences, of interactions, and of participation. And today we have a very eclectic mix of presenters that I want to introduce you. 4 speakers, so we'll have conversations, which is part of our new forum, Flux Live, conversations with these 4 speakers. Dr. Ali Hossaini, the co-director of National Gallery X. Ali Hossaini is a researcher, an artist, a philosopher, a writer, and yeah, not at least the co-director and co-founder really of National Gallery X. We have Evgenia Emets, founder of the Analema Group, an art collective that I'm personally part of, and Evgenia and Ali will tell us a bit about ongoing programming really both at the National Gallery X and also what Analema Group has been working on at National Gallery X and beyond. We've got Francesca Colussi from the Department for Time-Based Media Art, so display and exhibition sections at the Tate Modern. And we've got the principal academic of the National Center for Computer Animation, Eike Falk Anderson, with us. And following this, we'll have a round table with all the 4 speakers and a demo by Deborah Trujinov, who will be presenting her work on new types of heritage experiences with us. Yeah, so I think without any further ado, I would like to let you zoom into our YouTube premiere. I've posted the link here in the chat. But our plan is actually to stream everything via Zoom, so you shouldn't need to leave our Zoom conversation. Just stay tuned here. This is a backup plan, so if you have any difficulties, any streaming difficulties via Zoom, please feel free to swap over to YouTube Premiere and to watch our very fast Flux live conversations about new heritage on there. I've muted all of you for now. So following these conversations, we will have time for the roundtable. Please feel free to raise your hand if you have any questions, drop any questions in the chat. But also, we very much encourage a lively discussion afterwards about these different aspects of new heritage. So I will let Maria and Mena do the magic and start our Flux Live conversations. Enjoy. Let's welcome Eike Falk Anderson from the National Center for Computer Animation. Your research specifically focuses on computer graphics and animation and cultural heritage. What are the possibilities for new media to support new experiences of heritage?
Well, I think one of the main areas is really what's now termed virtual heritage. So partially interactive tours or interactive experiences where one can, say, step into the past to witness past events, see reconstructed buildings or historical or archaeological sites. Other areas that this computer graphics can really help with is intangible heritage. So the allowing audiences to visit and experience things that are not tangible, such as rituals or traditions, see how things have been played out, specific events in history that are not tangible but of some form of historical or cultural significance.
Great. Could you name some of the most successful of these examples to make cultural heritage more accessible?
I'd say there are quite a few examples. I can think of one specifically, and that's the Egyptian Oracle by Public VR, which is an American, I think, non-profit organization, and that is a mixed reality performance where audiences visit a live reenactment of a public ceremony from Egypt's late period, and that includes both real and virtual actors, so a real actor to guide the audience through the ritual, virtual actors, so various priests that take part in it. Then there's audience participation, and everything happens within a theater where a real-time graphics Egyptian temple is projected onto a screen on the stage. So that's one example that I think is a particularly good example of real mixed reality and the merger of the new technology and with the heritage context.
Yeah, it's absolutely fantastic. I know that in your research you've been looking quite a bit at principles for computer-based visualizations in the context of cultural heritage, for instance, the London Carter and others. Could you tell us a bit more about efforts to provide such guidelines for a community of experts?
Sure. I mean, my main interaction with this is actually through teaching students and make sure that they understand this. So, for example, the London Carta from 2009 for the computer-based visualization methods in cultural heritage contexts is really about setting out principles regarding documentation of the work, sustainability, and access. So also making sure that if you recreate something where there's a reconstruction uncertainty, so you don't know exactly how something looked. You also then make sure that the areas where you used educated guesses on how something might have looked in the past are clearly marked as such, so as not to really deceive the public and audiences about what it was. So being honest about what you know and don't know, and also explaining why you think that it probably looked like this rather than that. It's also then really providing also a robust foundation for specific implementation guidelines for other really more domain-specific areas, because this is such a wide area where you might look at different elements. Each specific domain might need to just use the London Carta as a base to then build on. For example, for virtual archaeology, the specific implementation guidelines based on London Carta were put down in the so-called Seville principles, where you look at ways of computer visualization and management of archaeological heritage specifically. And it's really all about making sure there's proper academic documentation. You also make sure that everything is sustainable. There are ethical considerations that one should follow. So an example is if one deals with specific indigenous heritage, then these indigenous groups should also be consulted and involved in the projects. And finally, it's also about making sure that there's appropriate access to various elements of the public. So it's really about promoting intellectual and technical rigor for the visualization of the cultural heritage.
Super fascinating. Yeah, it seems like there is a renewed interest to preserve living heritage. Specifically, the UNESCO just launched an app to preserve living heritage now during COVID-19, and the Lottery Heritage Fund has offered new funding possibilities for artists to preserve contemporary heritage. So I was wondering if you think that there is an opportunity for media artists to contribute to this wider discourse on preservation and accessibility of cultural heritage?
I would say pretty much everyone could contribute. So I wouldn't just restrict this to media artists. So there are various, for example, crowdsourced initiatives like Scan the World, or various other elements through Sketchfab, where you essentially do photo scanning, so photogrammetry, by taking photographs of sculptures or other cultural objects, and then make these publicly accessible, where, for example, Scan the World, I think, allows both either providing the finished 3D models that have been created, using whatever means. So even if you started from really just modeling things from scratch, although obviously the scan would probably be more historically and accurate, or just taking your set of photographs that you've taken and then you upload those so they can be processed into a 3D model. So that really allows then to make sure that things can be preserved to the point, ideally, so if one follows the specific guidelines with a quality that will allow people to really, if necessary, recreate things that are lost. An example could be the Triumphal Arch in Palmyra, which has been recreated with 3D printing, although there are also concerns there, for example, about the actual accuracy and why only parts of it were recreated, whereas others were not. So at least the possibility is there.
Yeah, fantastic. Would you, as a researcher, but also as a teacher, would you have any particular recommendations or tips for artists and practitioners who want to contribute to this effort ready for computer-aided cultural heritage?
Especially if you're taking photographs in areas where you are not able to control lighting, and also to take into account, for example, of differences with camera equipment, is to also always have a standard color chart that, to then include within the image, so that if there is any need for color correction of the recorded imagery, that actually then results in accurate representations. And also making sure that as much context is recorded as possible. So at least, location of where something was recorded, if it's something that is actually somewhere standing in the public.
It's almost a bit of a detective work where you have to show that you're communicating all of the different choices and findings and to the public, isn't it? Yeah. So the National Center of Computer Animation is known to promote science in the service of the arts. And I was wondering, from your point of view as a principal academic, how do you think science can help to make cultural heritage more accessible?
The main areas that this really helps is by providing the infrastructure. So the actual creation of the software that will allow artists or practitioners to then create the cultural artifacts.
Thank you so much, Eike. Our next speakers are Evgenia Emets from the Analema Group and Adi Hossaini, co-director of National Gallery X. Yeah, first question is to you, Adi. The National Gallery X is a new digital studio by the National Gallery and King's College London. And as its co-director, part of your remit is to recontextualize the wealth of heritage the National Gallery has to offer. Can you tell us a bit about your strategies in looking at the heritage of National Gallery X and the role of media in this context?
That's a really good question. If you look at the National Gallery, wonderful institution and founded with, I think, the best intentions, but at this point, it almost ossifies the art experience. And on the one hand, you treat these objects with reverence. On the other hand, they're frozen like flies, frozen in amber, which I think makes it really brittle. So National Gallery X is based on a series of residencies, and the residents are encouraged to enter into a conversation with these artists of the past so that it feels alive and very present. And we want to make sure that it's a conversation among equals. We'll let the future decide who the great artists of the past are. The second part of the strategy is that I think art is always high tech. And that's another thing that's been lost in the institutionalization of the National Gallery and the split between the National Gallery and the Tate Modern, as if, well, the Tate Modern is contemporary and, the National Gallery is old. And the thing to keep in mind always is that the artist is always high tech. Every stage of the National Gallery, these guys were doing the most high tech things they could at the time. And the results were just as astonishing to the audiences of the past as virtual reality is to us today. So I always want to emphasize the fact that even though we're doing these technological residencies, that there's also a technological continuum of innovation and the surprise that audiences feel when they see the world expressed in this innovative way, or they see new forms of self-expression. And then the third part of the strategy is, I think people can do whatever they want, but I find that art for art's sake has led to some dangerous schisms in our society. So for me, the art that we're doing at National Gallery X is art yoked to a social purpose. And, if you look where my background is, I'm coming out of the King's College London Department of Engineering, not the arts side of it. So I think this is really important because right now we essentially live in a very synthetic, engineered world. And a lot of the aspects of that world are inhumane, particularly to people who are neurodiverse, but also quite unpleasant for anybody compared to, say, the natural environment. So we need to yoke art back to social purpose and start to have a humane engineering so that we build a world that's pleasant to live in and that is accessible to everybody.
Thank you so much. Evgenia, you are the founder of Analema Group, and as said, you have actually had a residency at National Gallery X. Can you tell us a bit about the practices with Analema Group and the types of multisensory experiences that you create?
Thank you for the question, Oliver. And yes, I'm going to say a few words about Analema Group. So the group is a collaborative collective of artists, and I founded it in 2010 with the purpose of creating collaborative projects around immersive experiences, performance, installation work, engaging with interactive immersive technologies. And we've been working together with yourself, Oliver, Alan, and now David also came on board for many years. And we've created a whole series of site-specific experiences, which ranged from a one-person performance in a specific space to multi-person's performance in a space like Roundhouse in London, for example. And so, for example, the latest project we've developed with and for National Gallery X is Color, where we are looking at the traditional classical painting and the color palettes and the color materials, color minerals that have been used by painters, and how we could reimagine that color, how could we create a multidimensional experience of that color. But also then how does it relate back to the audiences and how audiences via our immersive 360 video degree experience on YouTube would go back to the gallery and then look at the paintings once again and perhaps look from a different angle. And that experience includes both the visual and sonic experience, and we're also hoping that once we have a possibility and can come back to physical space, we can also include the physical presence of that experience at the National Gallery X as a light and sound experience.
Great, thank you so much. My next question is to Adi. Adi, in the wake of the health crisis around COVID-19, the National Gallery and National Gallery X led by example in proposing new avenues to experience its collection at home. I was wondering if the future of heritage can involve these new types of remote experiences.
I think that the future of heritage always was going to involve remote experiences. If we look at what's going on with networks and the internet in particular, there's this trend called convergence, where you have the convergence of the internet first with the postal system, and then you have it with magazines and written materials, and finally with its absorbed television. And I think the next stage in networkization or virtualization is going to be with architecture. So it's a very natural step to start to take architecture and make it distributed online. So COVID accelerated this trend of convergence, namely the convergence of the internet with architecture and with immediate physical experience with virtual physical experience. But this is a trend that's been happening anyway, and it's definitely going to be the future, because even though heritage institutions will always, well, I hope always exist as physical places where people come and visit, there are many people who can't visit for various reasons. It could be expense, it could be disability or accessibility, or just geographic remoteness. So what we want to do is be able to bring some kind of rich experience to everybody wherever they are on the planet.
Great, thank you. Evgenia, you were telling us about Color as an art piece that allows audience to explore classic artworks at the National Gallery from home. How do you actually translate these original artworks as new heritage?
Yeah, it's really good question because we usually being asked, are we just representing artworks in a different way, or are we creating something completely new? And of course, I think it's a little bit of both, but I'm just hoping that it's much more of creating new work, because just by the virtue of using completely different technology and by we're just bypassing materiality of the medium, right? So we're working here with immersive three-dimensional sound, which can be experienced either through earphones or through speakers, and depending on the quality of the playback technology, you could really have a full immersive experience, and you can sense this sound because we're using quite a large range of frequencies. On the other hand, talking about the visual perspective, we are immersing the audience really into the three-dimensional field of vision, as if they were inside the painting, not quite concrete, much more kind of a sense, the atmosphere, the movement of color, and the movement of elements of the painting. And what we're actually doing is imagining our starting point, apart from picking the tones and the colors, we're also imagining how the painting would sound in real life. What are all the sounds that inhabit the painting? What is it that's making it alive, along with the colors and the story and the characters and the narrative and the history behind it and the personal history of painter or the subject? How do the sounds affect? And then we are actually bringing those sounds and creating the narrative, the story, which I believe it's quite a new story, because of course we are artists, so we are being inspired by what we imagine or what we see in the painting, what we know from histories, but we are not really trying to build something that's, okay, it's just purely representational.
I seem to remember that you used the word reimagining, and I quite liked it. So kind of reimagine an artwork, and in a way it feels like they're becoming more accessible to new audiences who might be, just be interested in a specific angle, in this case maybe color of that painting. Adi, I was wondering if you think that artists have a role to play here as a facilitator to these classic collections and classic heritage. And also if there are any pitfalls or advantages that artistic mediation and specifically new media can play in this context.
I think that artists have a critical role to play in the conversation that goes on about art through the ages. And an artist is particularly well situated to decide, for instance, how to interpret a color. We see all these controversies about just, the restoration of paintings and the restoration of heritage buildings. And there are a lot of aesthetic decisions to be made. And I think, along with the people who are historical experts, say, in the chemistry of particular paint or how lacquer ages and whether the lacquer looked like, was it all dusky looking now, when Rembrandt put it on, or is that the consequence of the centuries? Artists should be part of that dialogue. I think another part that's really important for the accessibility is that, the art in a place like the National Gallery is taken out of context, and it's radically out of context. A lot of these places, a lot of the artworks there, they were supposed to be in someone's home, and they might have had a pretty sumptuous home, more of a palace than what we think of as a home, but it was still a personal living space, or it might have been a chapel within that space, or it might have been actually part of a cathedral that is quite a very large public space that has a lot of other artworks, a lot of architecture, and a lot of meanings associated with that. So what media art can do is help to bring back the original context of the art. I think that's the really strong part of it. I think the pitfall is that you might do it poorly, or you might do it with such a radical reinterpretation that you're losing the part of the heritage that we want to preserve, which is what was it like to experience these artworks, you know, in the 16th century or in the 17th century or 18th century, when they were displayed at a salon or in a palace or in a cathedral. So there's always a tension between trying to get back to the very, very original experience and also keeping it contemporary. I think media artists have a role to play in both, and that the curators and all the other experts are part of the people who decide on what the important part of that presentation is.
Fantastic. I've got a question to both of you, which is about the use of data and what role it plays in the context of these type of experiences. Maybe Evgenia, you can explain a bit how we work with data in the context of Kimakala.
Yeah, well, data for us has always been the kind of basic departure, sometimes in a more kind of analytical way, like we would use data for projects directly, or we would actually use data and interpret it in a specific, I mean, we would always interpret data because we work in the arts and we're not really scientists in terms of, I guess in the science, when we talk about data visualization or sonification, there's always this gap, this interpretative gap, and there's always a little bit of artistic approach. So even when I see scientific data sonification, for example, I'm kind of thinking, well, somebody made this decision, so somebody actually made a creative decision of how this thing should sound and where does the sound come from. So in that sense, we are on the other side of spectrum. We are making a quite honest approach. We're taking quite honest approach and saying, well, actually, as artists, we're going to give this data representation quite specific meaning, because we are thinking from the perspective of what is the experience we want to create for our audience, for ourselves, what kind of feeling we want to evoke in the space when they enter the space, what kind of space it needs to be, how does kind of pure data becomes alive in the space?
Anya, I'm going to ask you the same question from your point of view, because I think the concept of data is very key to what you're doing at National Gallery X, full stop, isn't it?
It is indeed, and I'll actually answer this question about data with two hats on. The first is, as an artist myself, data is a medium for expression. So it's yet another raw material like graphite or oil or acrylic that we can draw upon to express ourselves. And, you know, if you look at what data does mathematically, it expresses patterns, and everything in art is patterns. Everything we experience in nature is patterns. So, you know, actually, if you're drawing a sunflower, if you want to do it accurately, you use data to get the arrangement of seeds, because it's a Fibonacci sequence that arranges that, or, you know, the golden mean is a good way of drawing a nautilus shell. So data, now we really can get our grips on it through computers. It's a medium of expression, and it's one that we can use in the same way we've used every other medium. In my role as a co-director of National Gallery X, and also in, you know, more in the culture making sector, I would say data adds another voice into this dialogue that's been going on for, you know, a good 100 years or more between connoisseurs and art historians. On the one hand, you have these collectors who are connoisseurs, and they may say, well, look, you have to be a connoisseur to really understand this work of art. And connoisseurship, I think, right now is frowned upon a bit, but of course it drives the art market. That contrasts with the idea that then, you know, you have to have knowledge of the artistic gestures and how it relates to other artists, not necessarily through appreciation, but through a kind of analysis. And if you look at the way there's been this idea, well, how do we, you know, there's a fascination with how paintings are made, you know, and a connoisseur may say, oh, this is absolutely the result of, you know, Picasso's hand and, or, you know, Tintoretto. And somebody else will say, no, you can't. There are reasons why it's not. And, you know, for instance, there's this notion that there are certain artistic signatures that you can find in parts of the painting that are de-emphasized. For instance, the artist would always draw the hand a particular way because it wasn't the most important part, so they weren't trying to be that original. So you look for this kind of hidden signature in there. Now, what data does is gives us access to just another level and another approach to understanding art and how the art is constructed and ultimately appreciating it. I mean, for a long time, people have been taking X-rays and using other techniques, optical techniques, to discover underpaintings and look at how the artistic painting was developed and what was the role of the studio and the assistants in making this artwork. And now these images can be subject to data analysis as well as visual intuition. So I think what we now have really a three dialogues, three strong voices, all of them with really, significant, important, and they're all worthy of listening to. And one is the approach of the connoisseur, the other is the approach of the art historian and maybe the traditional curator. And increasingly now we have the data scientist who is able to go in and crunch numbers that are extracted from these other forms of analysis.
Yeah, and it seems like the artists are coming in to help to make these numbers, turn them into something that you can understand and experience. The next question I had was about this idea of a paradigm shift that is happening in the discussion of the term heritage, from an understanding of heritage as something that is a cultural legacy towards something of an understanding of heritage as something lived and contemporary and actual, kind of happening right here in the moment. Would you agree that there is such a change of conception? And if so, how does National Gallery reflect on this, Ali?
Well, let's get back to that statement I said at the beginning, which is that the National Gallery, by virtue of its institution and public support, and essentially embodying the canon of Western art, has become ossified. So you have, an ossuary. You're looking at what you think of are dead bones, but I think right now the streets are telling us that heritage is something that's living and alive and impacts us now, particularly in my home country of America, in my hometown of Richmond, Virginia, which was the capital of the Confederate States of America, where these statues have a power, and they're powerful enough for people to fight over them and fight the statues. And you saw the people drawing pulling a statue into the harbor of Bristol. So it's clear that actually heritage is living and is alive. So I think it's a very good time for National Gallery X to be thinking about how all the elements of cultural heritage that are embodied in the collection, for instance, the imbalance in representations of women, and how that becomes embodied into the culture and embodied into the canon and then embodied into teaching about it. It's a time to look at heritage as something that is living, influential, and also subject to change. So there's a really famous book out there. Is it called How Buildings Live or How Buildings Grow? I can't quite remember what it is, but artworks too evolve with the time. And National Gallery X is, I hope, helping people to engage in that conversation and have a healthy evolution and dialogue with the past and the influence that the past continues to have on the present.
Thank you so much, Ali. Evgenia, I know that one of our other projects, Analema Group's recent project, Kima Noise, is also talking about heritage as something that is organic, present, and alive. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about the film Kima Noise and how it talks about oral heritage of community experiences, specifically in the context of urban noise.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Oliver, for the question. So yes, so in November 2019, we did an experience, an exhibition, a series of workshops at Tate Exchange in the building of Tate Modern, and our focus was to look at urban noise holistically from many different perspectives. We believe that the soundscapes that surround us every day have incredibly powerful effect on us. And we created this experience from live sounds from the vicinity of Tate Modern and imagined how people could actually rearrange these sounds with their movement in space, with drawing the sound trajectories, with experiencing the visual, effect of sound on buildings and on humans, and engaging into conversations through bringing local communities on board. So basically, this project is really looking, I believe, at a larger perspective on this living heritage, which is soundscapes, or how the living heritage is, cultural heritage is reflected in that specific thing that we sometimes don't notice or prefer not to notice because perhaps it's a little bit disturbing. And it's known that urban noise can have good or not so good effect on us. There are many different studies, and we've collaborated with scientist Stephen Stansfield to bring this conversation basically to the light, to open the door to a little bit into something that's not so much voiced, because we're so much focused on the visual realm. So through a series of experiences and through our installation and the publication of the book and making of the film, Human Noise, we basically started exploring the subject, which I believe we will explore further. And I think the answering your question further here, the point is that, well, it's actually constantly changing. So the good example is during COVID, there were multiple articles from around the world, how the world got quieter, cleaner, how biodiversity got back. So basically our soundscapes changed everywhere almost immediately. I think it was the matter of 1 or 2 months. Bird life came back, and there were less cars, there were less airplanes, there was less traffic everywhere. And I think it just shows us that perhaps cultural heritage is a living thing and it has intentionality to it. And what if this intentionality can be used in relation to such thing as urban noise? And there are, of course, people who are doing that, who are kind of designing spaces where sound will be pleasing, or it is not so detrimental to our health, or things will be balanced much more through introduction of water, green space, and so on. So we're hoping to continue this research and kind of continue looking deeper into, what is emerging and what is changing, and kind of playing around with with what we can contribute as artists, I guess, through artistic expression, but also through bringing communities into that conversation, communities and also other artists into this conversation.
Thank you, Evgenia. Ali, last question to you was about the future of heritage experiences for institutions. You were talking about the possibilities. What kind of specific possibilities do you see emerging through new technology? Where do you see the biggest potential for these experiences to change and to evolve?
Well, I think first I'd like to emphasize that, just what a powerful response Evgenia had to your last question. And this is about urban noise, which is a matter of great concern to me. And I think that actually that's just the kind of thing we need to be doing. At the beginning, I talked about having a more humane environment and the role artists can play in having a more humane environment, and the deep schism between the culture of engineering and the culture of artists. And I think it's, losing the sensitivity to what constitutes a comfortable or beautiful world is one of the greatest losses of the two cultures. And, when you have this specialization where engineers are just trained in mathematics and building machines, and, you might say, well, to cross the street, you have to have this really shrill noise to tell you it's okay to cross the street, but that alienates a lot of people who find that shrill noise either annoying or even painful. So I think this is where you really need artists and engineers to be working together. There's a certain kind of communication that needs to happen in engineering, but there's a way of doing it that the artist is going to be more sensitive to. So I think it's really critical to have the kind of combination that Kima Noise, the combination of arts and engineering, and that questioning of the built environment that Kima Noise has engaged in. So I say that's the first part of my answer. I think, when it comes to heritage experiences, I also emphasize that, well, what we have at the National Gallery seems, a bit like frozen in time, and it's really not. This has always been high tech. So National Gallery X, it might seem like we're breaking with the traditions of the National Gallery. Actually, I think we're recovering the traditions of the National Gallery. And I always want to emphasize these continuities between the high-tech artists of the past and the high-tech artists of the future, and in fact say, well, the artists are always pushing the boundaries and trying to find and make beautiful things. So I think, just to repeat your question, what possibilities does new technology and new media hold for the audience of the future? I think, and this relates to Evgenia's answer too, is we have to find the poetry in the machine, and we have to put the poetry in the machine. I mean, humanity has always been building, new engineering projects, and actually writing started out as accounting. A lot of what we call, painting and perspective, it started out as a way of, civil design, and painting itself was there to glorify rulers, not as a form of self-expression. So they all started out as machines, but they ended up as poems. So I think that's the role that we can play in continuing to build our cultural heritage in the future, is let's put the poetry in the machine.
Thank you so much. We will have time for a Q&A right after this. So thank you so much for your wonderful answers and contributions. And our final speaker for today is Francesca Colussi from the Tate Modern. Hello, Francesca. Thank you so much for joining us. Would you like to maybe introduce yourself briefly and give us a bit of an introduction of what you do at Tate Modern in the time-based media department?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Oliver. Thank you so much, first of all, for inviting me. And then I'm going to share a screen so to do a little bit of an introduction. So my name is Francesca, and I am a time-based media conservator / technician. Been working at Tate for the past 4 years and with a great team of time-based media conservation. Just to give you a brief introduction on the collection, because I'm not sure people will exactly know what time-based media conservation is, because we're quite a rare beast, I would say. The time-based media collection of Tate is approximately 750 artworks. It includes videos, software-based artworks, sound artworks, performance, film, and slide-based artworks. We are, I would say, a fairly new discipline, because the first time-based media artwork that Tate acquired was by Gilbert and George in 1972. And then little by little, they started to kind of try to figure out how to preserve these works and how to present them. And then, just to give you a bit of a timeline, in 2003, the first performance and software-based artworks have been acquired, so fairly recently. And I think this adds a little bit of complexity. And so the team started to grow, and the institution started to feel the need to actually have a dedicated team to take care of this type of artworks. So we actually grew pretty fast, and at the moment we are 13. Plus, we work with a lot of freelancers, specialists, very niche specialists, I would say, and like contractors. We are a mixed, I would say, very mixed background team, because there is no sort of like official education and like in time-based media conservation. So we all come from very, very different backgrounds. I went to art school in Italy, and I've never thought back in days that I was going to end up doing this. I thought I was going to become an artist, but then things kind of changed. And then the 13 people in the team are divided into sort of, I would say, 2 big blocks. One is the people who take care of acquisitions, and then exhibition and display. And I do work with the team that does the delivery of exhibition and displays at Tate Modern, Tate Liverpool, Tate Britain and St. Ives. Actually, like Liverpool has a bit more of a dedicated team, but we do support them quite a bit. So it's definitely like cross venue affair. And last year I was the conservator for the Steve McQueen and the Mark Leckey exhibitions at Tate Modern and Tate Britain. So I did work closely with the artists because I think it was quite particular because there were very few collection works. A lot were loan-ins, and like in the case of Mark Leckey, for example, he did a very sort of like special exhibition which had a bit of I think a commission feel because it was very, very site specific. So what we do is that we take care, I would say we take care of the artworks. So we find strategies for the conservation of this type of artworks. And then we also find ways to display them in the context. And I think it's quite interesting to sort of make the distinction between our team and the AV team at Tate, because there is a brilliant AV team, and they work mainly with like events and commissions. So we tend more and more to collaborate, especially like when it's the case of, I would say, like performances. But there is a distinction because we work mainly with artworks and they're more like event based. And then I've got another few slides, but not many, just to sort of like give you an example of what we do and like the contents in which we work. I put together a few images. So the one in the middle is the only image I could give you of the Steve McQueen show, which is still a sort of like a switching on. And for copyright reason, I can't actually show you exactly what like images of the artworks. And then you've got my colleagues, Jack and Rob at Stores preparing like some 60mm film works. And then on the bottom left, you've got some images of like CRT monitors. So like I would say more legacy equipment. And then bottom right, it's like testing. So testing of artworks that we always do Tate Stores in Old Kent Road. Before displaying. And then on the top right, there is an example of one of our like media shelves. So all the media gets stored and archived at Tate Stores. And at the moment, we're also working on like trying to have a sort of high value digital repository for everything, which it's a bit of a task. And then another little slide to show you. So this is more specifically, there are a few images of the Mark Leckey show, which was a pretty epic mission. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but like it was this huge motorway, reproduction of a motorway bridge in which we nested a lot of equipment because it was, I would say, it was a sort of like a performative work in a way, like a sort of like a theater sort of base artwork we had a lot of like technology that had to be synchronized, a lot of footage that was actually worked, like edited and elaborated on site. So we had to sort of wing it a lot of time. And I think the result, I'm very proud of the result. So yeah, so there is a bit of a distinction between collection works that have a bit more of like I think we archive them, so we have a bit more of like an historical knowledge of the artworks. So as a conservator and technician, I think we are able to give more advice to curator on how to put them in context. And then there are like loans-ins, and in this case, like big exhibitions that are a bit more, that look or feel a little bit more like a commission. So we need to work and collaborate with artists to do so. So I am gonna stop sharing this because I want to see you better.
Thank you so much, Francesca. Yes, what a great first overview of your work, and it shows already how complex the work is that you're doing, both in terms of technology and in terms of preservation and conservation. I was also intrigued about this kind of specific role of heritage in this context, because to me it feels like heritage is not just something that is antique in your case, but it's something that is very much lived contemporary. And also, it's not always about just displaying existing heritage, but also creating physically new heritage, like in this case, where part of what you're doing is putting something on that will, by its essence, be part of our cultural heritage, I guess.
Yeah, and actually, like, this is, I mean, it feels maybe a bit pretentious, but when you told me about like the theme of like heritage, I actually thought I recently finished to read this book by Franco Berardi, and there is a little quote that he talks about like artists at some point, and it says, I'm going to read it because the artist speaks the language of conjunction. In the artistic creation, the relation between sign and meaning is not conventionally fixed, but pragmatically displaced and constantly renegotiated. So it's something that I really, for me, it's very interesting, because I always thought about artists as sort of an artist as translators of like the world around. And I do believe that art has also like a political role. And therefore, heritage, I think it's something that speaks about our world, and it's always transforming. And I love that artists like to experiment, and it's a place of conjunction.
This actually leads me to my next question, which was about kind of changing technology, because as a media artist, I know that very often technology just dates, and a piece of software you use today might not run on the next version of Windows or a Mac, and the same is probably true with some of the television sets that you might work with or so. How do you, in your department, how do you deal with these also technical challenges? Are there limits to how much you can go back in time and kind of reconstruct what a media artist of, say, the 80s wanted to produce?
So the idea, and again, because going back to like preserving intention, is that we try as much as we can to preserve the technology as well. So I don't know, I'm thinking about, for example, Nanjing Pike, a lot of like the CRTs and a lot of the equipment is sort of like, it's legacy, but it's also bespoke. So we always try to find strategies to actually display the works with the legacy technology. But then, there is a problem with obsolescence. And I was thinking about it, and then, for example, one of the things that we do is that in the process of acquisition, my colleagues, most of the time, if possible, interview the artist to actually together to try to present to the artist this sort of like issues. And so to together try to understand what is the preference of the artist. So if there is a preference towards like, I don't care about this type of equipment, we can definitely use, it can evolve, then we actually try to make this evolve. And if it's very contextual and very also necessary to the meaning and to the intention of the artwork and the artist, we try to preserve it. And for example, you talked about software, and I'm not an expert of my colleague Patricia actually is like specifically working a lot on software-based art, and my colleague Tom as well. And I think there are a lot of different challenges, and like one route, for example, is emulation. But again, it's a lot about preserving the experience as well. And therefore the environment and the context. So yeah, loads of challenges.
I was wondering if there are any approaches, if you're trying to take some of the work that you're physically making accessible, if you're also you're making it accessible online, especially now post-COVID-19, if there are any renewed efforts to take some of these experiences into the virtual realm?
Yeah, that's also a challenge, because I think again it's a fine line between accessibility and context and intention. So for example, I know that like recently Tate, I don't know if it's been done yet or they are about to do it, had a like conversation with Arthur Jaffa, and then they're going to put Love is the Message online to be streamed together. I think with other museums, they're doing this online. They're going to present it online. Like I think it's important not to lose the sense of like context, because I've been asked before about, for example, the Apichatpong Verastica tool installation primitive. I've been asked, oh, why don't you guys put the videos online and make them accessible? And so my answer was like, because the artwork is not just the video. The artwork is an installation in a specific space, and therefore it's that kind of experience. So it is very tricky, and I think, well, if the artist is alive, again, I would always ask permission, and this is what we normally do. And I think there is definitely a push for like making more works accessible. And I think post-COVID, also a lot of artists actually agreed on like doing that. And I think this is what we're going to try to do. And then another thing that for us is quite, I think, important and something that we reflect a lot on is documentation. So, because we do it for the collection works, but then there is also like the challenge of like, if an artwork is not accessible, like I'm thinking about performances, for example, like would the artist agree on like having the public experience a documentation of the artwork? So that could be another way, I think, to put more things online. But it's tricky because, you know, in one way, and I experienced it with like, I don't know, I think probably like everyone also during this lockdown period, like we always talk online, but it's a different experience. It's beautiful because we can always be in touch, but it is a different experience. So I think it's important to understand and to give the right priorities.
Great, yeah. I mean, it's wonderful that you have this dialogue and that this active discussion and negotiation is taking place. And I think, yeah, it's going to be fascinating to see what the future will hold in this context. I had a question about sustainability. It's a subject that is quite dear to Art in Flux. One of our co-founders, Afra Shemza, has worked quite a bit on this, and she actually held a similar kind of talk about sustainability and media art. And so I was wondering, because it must be quite difficult, I guess, at the big institution like the Tate to have the ability to assure that the artworks that you preserve and conserve, that this ethos of sustainability is being kept in mind. How do you go about it?
So it's definitely a tricky challenge because we are not makers. So we don't decide what kind of equipment, what kind of technology, what kind of materials should be used in the artwork. But I think, well, one thing, I don't know, there are different ways, and it's a discussion that we had as a team a lot of times. And like, I think the preserving like equipment, it's one of the ways, and like preserving the knowledge of like fixing a lot of equipment is something that we are trying to actively do all the time. Because like we work, for example, with a lot of specialists, and we try to be there. We try to document their practice. We try to also ourselves to learn how to fix things, and that's something that I think it's very important. And then, you know, Tate has a dedicated department that takes care of recycling. So thanks to a few of my colleagues who actually dedicated quite a bit of time being in touch with them, like for example, for like projector lamps, all these consumables, we actually tried more and more to put in place like practices that are a little bit more sustainable. And then, you know, it's such a difficult one because, for example, if I think about like just like power, energy, like what it takes to like have all the equipment running. And like what we do, we try to put a lot of equipment on timers. We try to be sensible about like switch on and off, also to preserve the equipment. But it's definitely, I still feel it's a challenge. It's very, very difficult. Also because we are a public institution, and for example, it's quite difficult to be able to like donate equipment, and it's very resource and time consuming, because I cannot just give you something. It's a public domain. So again, we are trying to like together to brainstorm and find practices that are more sustainable, also to be able to give away equipment, give away materials.
I find it really reassuring that there's an awareness about the subject, and that there's a dedicated department that is looking at means and ways to optimize a difficult situation. Yeah, you mentioned to me in a previous conversation that there's a bit of a concern that part of what you're doing, and it's what you said today as well, is that you really want to prevent from big museums to function as an arc of the arts, to just be this kind of conservator, and that you want to go away from this. And as a last question, I just wanted to ask you, what do you see as a potential to counteract such tendencies, and what could we do? What are new approaches to assure that heritage really is something new and lived and alive?
Yeah, I think that's a difficult one, and also something that I've been thinking a lot about, because and I mentioned to you like the Hita Stare essay that I wrote, in which she talks about Freeport art, and this idea, and it's also linked to like this analysis that Zizek does on the movie Children of Men, which depicts this Tate Modern. It's actually shot, I think, between the Battersea power plant and Tate Modern, and Tate Modern is called the Arc of the Arts. And I think Hita Stare kind of picks this up a little bit again and writes about it a bit more. And this, especially during the lockdown, is sort of like prompt me to think about this kind of catastrophic dystopic Armageddon kind of scenario of like, what about, if art will never be accessible? Like, I love, and I think what kind of gives me the enthusiasm of like doing my job is that I work for a public collection, and it's accessible, it's for the people, and it's in a building that is supposed to be like free, and where you can walk in and just look at this. So during the lockdown, when we were closed, I thought, okay, what about if we will never be able to do this? Like, would my job make sense? What are we preserving if it's not accessible? And and I think it's really a difficult one, because again, I think documenting, it's something that we do also, like in our job, there is a little bit of this thinking about the dystopia. So it's like this kind of like, I'm taking care of this artwork because otherwise it will disappear, and it is our heritage, it's our history, it's someone's creation that speaks about the world and speaks about politics. So you do always think about this, but at the same time, it's this kind of beautiful enthusiasm for like people like accessing and like using the art to think. And I think, we still have, there's still a lot of like issues, and we've got a long way to go and a lot of work to still do on accessibility. And I think that we need like augmented reality, virtual reality, as much as we need live performances, then we should not be scared of going forward while we are looking back. So it's a tricky one, because I think I believe in technology as like something also that can help us access something, but then I want both things, I want the physical aspects, I want the bodies in the space, but I also want to be able to sort of like dream and and explore in a very virtual way. And, you know, it's the duality, and I keep on going back and forth. And I think our profession is a lot about that.
Yeah, and it sounds like with the work that you do, you're actively working on the fact that art doesn't become duty-free art and does remain accessible. And yeah, so yeah, thank you so much for this. We'll have time for Q&As in a bit. And yeah, thank you so much for your incredible overview of your practice.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thanks.
Yeah, so a big thank you to all the different speakers and your incredible contributions. So interesting and so many different points of view. I tried to kind of unpack this because I feel we're really discussing not one thing, but kind of three different things here. On the one hand side, this idea of preserving and also accessing classic heritage and how we can reinvent it and reimagine it. Like Eike explained a little bit in his practice and his research. And then on the other hand, to create all new heritage experience, like the ones that Ali is facilitating, but also Francesca is facilitating and Analema Group is creating. And last but not least, this idea of intangible heritage and how we can make that more accessible, which kind of was shining through. And it's on this last point that I just want to invite a very quick demo before we go over to the roundtable and the Q&As. And so we've got Deborah Trujinov here, who will be presenting very briefly her own practice in cultural heritage experiences before we open the floor to Q&As. Deborah, are you here with us?
Yep, I'm here.
Oh, hi.
Hi. Hello. Hi, Flux. Thanks for having me on. So without further ado, I'll just do, it's a quick sort of 5-minute presentation of some of the work, and I'll keep it, I might have to keep it on browser mode still. That's not the one to share. Should be that. That is so weird.
And then, yeah, if you then go into slideshow, you should be able to play it.
And I think it's slideshow. So in brief, while it's letting, so yeah, my name is Deborah Trujinov. I don't think we need subtitles. And I am an artist working with sort of, my practice is around theory and applied based practice, and I work a lot with emerging technology, also combined with sculpture as well. And I always like starting the slide because it's something that I always sort of default to, which is a page from Stuart Brand's Whole Earth catalogue, where he has this sort of image of different cultures, and there are many ways of doing things besides your own. In brief, I'm interested in things like idealism, utopias, environmentalisms, ecologies, world building, and other forms of knowledge. And that's a very important part of my practice. So just to truncate a sort of number of years of work altogether, my sort of interest has always been in Mongolia. And that is partly because it is part of my heritage. And also there's a lot of fascinating aspects about the country, which I'm sort of relearning in a sort of distant way. And this is a really great sort of map about resources that you can find in different parts of Mongolia. And it's obviously, it's a contentious issue for the country for a number of reasons, which we don't have to get into at the moment. But a couple of years ago, I was asked to join a project in collaboration with an anthropologist who was working in Mongolia, and sort of had an opportunity of sort of bringing some of that research to life. And she was looking at extractive atmospheres and the impact on its community, land, language, ecology, etc. So this is me sort of trying to take the footage in the different sites and areas that she had been sort of working in. And to sort of skip forward a bit, or jump forward in time. So this was a piece as part of the sort of number of work that had been carried out through those initial sort of research project, which started in about 2017. Then most recently was a piece that was for the V&A at Digital Design Weekend. And And of course, I was very, very curious about the construction of yurts and the way they were created and the sort of meaning of yurts. And this is from a book called The Architecture of the Nomads, with some very, very beautiful illustrations on the differences and the nuances of structures and little details. So this got me to thinking about the piece that I wanted to create for the V&A, and I looked at, you know, sort of my interpretation of what I could with the fabrication tools necessary to kind of create something that I felt could be a good sort of shelter or structure to host participants in. And the sort of final piece looked like this. It was about two people in the same time entering the yurt or the, you know, structure or shelter, and then they were then being put to locations in Mongolia where 360 video was filmed. So this is an example of sort of a film of footage that was shown in a very remote region in Western Mongolia called Sukhor Lake. And it has lots of sort of stories around it as to sort of artisanal and gold mining. And the reason why it's sort of rendered in these sort of colors is because my practice also thinks a lot about 60s and 60s environmentalism. And then you think of places like the desert, you think of sort of these, you know, uninhabitable places on Earth. And this was very much like this. And there is a significance in this site as well to the sort of local community around it. The sound's not on, but it's this sort of very piercing dry wind that you kind of hear, which is an important sort of part. So then this was again re-shown at Slade, and this time I had a chance, of course, to sort of open up the structure a little bit and give it a little bit more transparency that I feel like it needed, and the lightness to it that I think is also part of the work. And then just as another example, the sort of two VR pieces were one scene that was shot within the yurt with this sort of community and the family that I was staying with. And for me, as part of this project, it was really important for me to also be in part of the shot with them, and that it wasn't something that was a sort of othering move, but something that was sort of done together. And this was, you know, just sitting around drinking tea, sort of meeting other parts of their family. And then when you sort of in the VR interaction, once you then sort of gaze at the door, you're then taken into that sort of desert landscape. So that's sort of in short, overall. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Yeah, great. I thought it was really important to hear, you know, your voice as a practitioner as well as everybody else. It's such an interesting canon of different takes on heritage and different routes, and yeah, how to preserve and how to really open heritage up and also reinvent it. My very first question actually from me to the panelists is really about this question of authenticity. Eike, you specifically mentioned this as something that you're looking at in your own research as part of looking into these kind of guidelines, the London Charter and the Seville principles. And I was wondering, really, a question to you, Eike, but also to you, Francesca, if you could tell us a bit more about the kind of challenges that you're facing in your practice in kind of media art and new technology experiences in assuring authenticity to heritage experiences. Maybe you could answer this question first and then bring it over to Francesca.
I mean, a lot of this, can you hear me? Just sing, yeah. Okay, a lot of this is really about also being honest and true, but also taking into account that sometimes we don't really know, especially when you're recreating something from the past, how it was exactly. So if we look at, say, ruined buildings, we might only have the foundations. From the foundations, we can gain information about probably the just from the thickness of the walls, how high the building was. But very often we don't have exact informations. and some of that we can also even perhaps see, Pompeii and Herculaneum. So quite a few buildings are were preserved under the ash, but other parts, it's like, we really just have the foundations or the first floor. We don't know what was on top of it. We can guess how it might look like from knowledge of contemporary Roman architecture, but we don't have the exact idea of how it was. So when we recreate it or create a reconstruction, it's important for the both authenticity, but also from the honesty to clearly state what was created from a best guess and what is really known.
Fantastic. Yeah, Francesca, I know that you're working sometimes directly also with artists to ensure authenticity. What happens if these artists are no longer around, for instance, and how do you generally assure that, especially with technology that might not be working anymore? How can you assure that things still come across as they were originally intended?
Yeah, it's quite interesting because I think both Ali and Eike touched in different ways, but on context, and I think that's actually something that for me it's quite important, is understanding. So doing your homework, and also, as Eike was saying, admitting that you can be ignorant and just be honest about it, but also do your homework, and also to think about a practical challenge. I was talking about obsolescence, and that is a real challenge. And what we do, it's usually getting, if the artists are not around, they're usually estates. And so we just enter in conversation. And I think it's a lot about then ethical choices. And as I was saying, preserving the intention. So trying to understand what was the context, what was the intention, and what we can do about it, and what is the new context as well, where we're asked to display something. So I think it's about collaborating and entering, and not being afraid of entering in this conversation and admitting that there is a lot that you don't know.
Yeah, I will actually just pick up on that point of intentionality. And I think it's actually also touching on something that Ali mentioned specifically, that every heritage has a political context as much as the context of creation. And I was interested in, Ali, from your point of view, because I know that the National Gallery acts is specifically looking at kind of reflecting and recontextualizing historic art with contemporary art. And I do think it's part of a canon of different efforts. So I think that the Royal Academy, for instance, has done beautiful shows, Michelangelo and Bill Viola, and they're currently working on Tracy Emin and Edward Munch. So there is an effort, but I really feel that what you're doing is outstanding in that respect, and assuring that you're recontextualizing, reframing a classic collection. Ali, are you with us? Did Ali drop off? Oh.
No. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
I want to just give you my very subjective response to the show at the Royal Academy with Michelangelo and Bill Viola. And this comes from the point of view where, of course, I've always recognized Michelangelo as a master. And Bill Viola, though, is an influence. And, all through my life, if there were a Bill Viola show, I'd go to it. He had a retrospective in San Francisco in the late 90s. I went 3 times and spent many hours there. And then when I went into the show, I thought, well, conceptually, this must really work, because they're both deeply spiritual. And they're both at the height of their game, or their craft, allegedly. But I was really dumbstruck at the power of these tiny Michelangelo drawings, basically, and studies next to Bill Viola's greatest works, which actually felt rather dated to me technologically. And, I'm old enough to remember when they came out and seeing this stuff in what was the highest resolution at the time, and slow motion was extremely powerful. But for some reason, at least in that context, it didn't stand up to time. and it certainly didn't stand up to the Michelangelos. So I think that's a situation where you have a really excellent curatorial concept, spiritual artists, both masters of their medium, but maybe it's just not fair to put anyone next to Michelangelo. That might be the lesson there. But I think that is something to keep in mind when we're trying to recontextualize art, particularly in a political context, because you have to do it successfully. So you have to give, you know, there's reasons why certain artistic masterpieces have lasted through the ages, and you have to give the contemporary artist a chance to thrive and actually, you know, have a successful dialogue. And I think we did this with Analema, which you were involved with too. And there was a reinterpretation of a number of masterpieces. And I feel like each work has its own integrity. So I think, you know, it is really important to go from the objective and the conceptual to the subjective, and also to think beyond curation. How do we actually mediate this? I keep coming back to the notion of dialogue, but I think that's essential, because, you know, any great painting you see in the National Gallery, there are, you know, several antecedents to it. There's the Titian show, which I guess is reopened now, but, you know, all of those paintings have antecedents. Titian was in dialogue with them. Maybe he's the most successful one. Maybe some people consider other paintings more successful. So when we're going into this, I think just from an aesthetic viewpoint, we have to really create an environment that supports the success of the contemporary artists, so that we can feel like there's a fair conversation going on and no one's getting overwhelmed. I think, though, politically, though, you know, we've talked about, earlier I mentioned just the representation of women in the National Gallery. Well, there's two forms of representation here, and they're both problematic. One is how women are represented, you know, on the walls of the National Gallery, and the other is the representation of women artists and the lack of access that women artists had. And while the space there is limited, everything there's supposed to be before 1917. So I think for National Gallery X in particular, we want to offer a kind of restitution to this and allow female voices or feminine perspectives or transgendered perspectives, multiple perspectives, to thrive and enter into this canon. And you know, we're not creating the canon. We're just creating opportunities for future generations to make the canon. But I think it's really important for us to do two things. One, to ensure that the dialogue, that both sides of the dialogue are, you know, stand up well, and, you know, and the other one is to make sure that we have a fair range of access. And that includes giving people the tools and the skills to become great artists. You know, one of the reasons women, you know, one of the big, there were many reasons why women didn't become, there weren't many great women artists, painters in the Western past. One of them was the lack of access to training. The other was lack of access to shows and resources. So these are all things that we have to be aware of. But I think ultimately we have to look at the success of the project, and then enable the participants of the project to become successful through creating a successful project, whatever that is, and whatever the goals of it are.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think this is something that the National Gallery really does very well, not just looking at paintings themselves, but also the histories behind it, and then making this explicit and talking about it. And yeah, that is already, you know, the right step in the right direction. We have a question from the audience, from Vera, who I asked to unmute herself. So I hope you can just ask the question yourself.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay, yes. Perfect. Hi everyone, my name is Vera Jussila. I'm a postgraduate student from Goldsmiths, and I study computational arts, and I have really enjoyed all the discussions this evening. And maybe kind of an introduction to my question, that in my own practice, I'm interested in the archives of heritage institutions and how those could be researched with computational tools like scraping with Python and that kind of methods. And I'm interested in like making connections of those getting those findings and making connections to the present discussions and also like how those questions of what kind of heritage we want to highlight and what has been hidden, how those could be presented to the museum audience, for example, in the form of interactive experiences. And this being kind of the introduction to my question, which I guess is mostly to Francesca and Ali, but I'm interested in all of your views. That do heritage institutions like look for people who work and research the archives and who want to kind of, or are interested in bringing these kind of archive findings to the audience? And I was thinking that, is it something that is usually what the is done via like employment, or is it via residencies or collaborations with freelancers? And I'm just kind of curious about the landscape, and also if there are like networks of artists who work with this kind of archives. Thanks.
Francesca, Ali, yeah, do you want to answer?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Francesca, would you like to go first on that?
Yeah, okay. Unfortunately, I have to say that we are a bit of a separate, like Tate has an archive, and then we do archive, but we are not technically an archive. I think because we are an institution, it's actually it's a very lengthy and painful process to be able to access. So theoretically you can, you can just book in and come to us and access anything. But in practical terms, there are resources involved, which means that someone will have to be with you. So yeah, when you were talking about using computational tools, I was thinking that we're still kind of at the Stone Age. And and that's why the issue around accessibility, it's a huge one. And then it was interesting because you were talking about hidden heritage, and it's already already the fact that we are a public institution, and there are acquisitions, and someone decides what gets acquired and what does not get acquired, means that there is a lot of hidden heritage that doesn't even come to the museum. And then of course, once it is in the museum, someone decides what gets displayed. So there is a lot of space to be critical about it. And yeah, also there is a research department at Tate, and I think that's probably, I don't know too much about it. We actually just started to collaborate a bit more. Okay. It's quite a recent thing. This more the will for more cross-departmental collaboration, I have to say. Yeah. But and they're probably, I think, the ones that you should get in touch with, maybe. I mean, please do get in touch with us. If you want to come to stores, we can show you around. There are many also more informal ways to sort of do it. I shouldn't say it, but there are. But there are also, yeah, it's not that easy.
Yep, thank you. Sounds good.
Perhaps to add to this, especially, I mean, it depends on really the type of archive or the type of archival material that you're looking for. In general, I mean, there is a trend towards more and more elements being digitized. Actually, at the National Center for Computer Animation, we are now starting a huge project on archiving actually computer animation. That Oliver is also involved in. But especially in digital archives, actually over the recent decade or so, some of the best work really has happened in the Baltic and Scandinavian countries. So at the forefront, probably Estonia, but Sweden is also quite good, especially for the digitization of the archives, and various other countries are quickly picking up on that. So Latvia is digitizing more and more of their work, or old documents, paintings, artworks, photographs. Same thing in Denmark as well.
Great, thank you, Eike. Ali, I think you had an answer as well, isn't it?
Yes, Well, I think it's a good question, and I'd like to give a particular perspective from the National Gallery, which, you know, it's interesting now that we're having a debate about heritage, because, and it's essentially a political debate, because heritage was something that was always decided in a very hierarchical way. You know, there was a small group of people and they say, well, this is what the heritage is, and then this other stuff doesn't count as heritage. And then, you know, humanities scholars and social scientists and historians started to uncover what they call the history of the common people and the popular people. And so there's like this pyramid of heritage. And the National Gallery's collection of, you know, less than 3,000 paintings represents a big chunk of the apex of that pyramid. So I think the very fact that we're having this discussion and talking about access to it and rethinking heritage shows an evolution in our society towards becoming more democratic, where there's larger and larger groups of people being involved in deciding this is our heritage or this isn't. And you know, we've seen this over the decades of people reclaiming heritage and redefining it. Now I think your particular question, I think, is particularly interesting, because now we have the tools for many, many more people to participate in the discussion. So to answer your question directly, yes, we are doing our best to turn our archive, which is not very large, inside out. And that starts with the most obvious things, which are the, you know, high resolution digital representations of these paintings. There are a number of other resources that are uncovered. You know, there are underpaintings, there are X-ray data involved, and all of this is something that could and should become basically in the public domain, because the public owns the National Gallery and should decide what's important. National Gallery X is specifically an effort. It's a joint institution with King's College London, but it's really about looking at how do we open this up? How do we take an institution which is the heritage, will continue to be heritage, and enable it to become flexible and redefinable? And I think data will be one of the tools for doing that. And if you know, there's been a lot of work in digital humanities on textual analysis, and you know, either using AI or an algorithm to look at word frequency, not just, and then not just word frequency, but the distance between words and among words, and finding out conceptually what's important. And that's actually really changed people's perspective on what idea, you know, we have an idea about what ideology was in 1780, but then a textual analysis reveals that no, actually these words and these associations were not so close as we thought. That's an anachronism. So I think on the one hand, there's some really important analytic work to be done with the kind of tools that you have to strip away our anachronistic assumptions about the past and about our heritage. Because, you know, oftentimes we justify our beliefs and our practices today by saying, well, it's always been that way. And then you look back and you say, well, no, it hasn't been. And here are reasons that any rational person would agree to. The other part is for people to decide what that heritage is. And we're doing that specifically now to really drill down through residency programs. Oliver and Evgenia are actually our first residents. So, and they did some really beautiful work that you can see now, and that I hope we'll be able to represent in the future. We are going to have open calls and more resources coming online, available for people like you and your colleagues and virtually anyone else to, if not participate, at least access these data. But we do want participation, and we're trying to figure out how best to do that. Obviously, we can only have so many residents. We want to open this up to the culture as a whole, and really make it a democratic institution. But there are contradictions right now between, you know, having the canon and having democracy. And we're actually, Oliver and Evgenia have really helped us advance our methodology towards reconciling that question.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah.
I actually wanted to just take you up on this particular point, and also this question of this ambiguity that you mentioned and this political dimension. And I thought this is maybe a question to the practitioners, so to Evgenia and to Deborah. How, in your own practice, how this concept of heritage has changed, and whether you're aware of the political component of the work that you're doing. Yeah, maybe to Evgenia first, and then to Deborah.
Thank you so much, Oliver, for the question. It's really good to be a part of this conversation. I mean, where do I even start with this question, right? I think right now, everything we are doing is political, and I mean, I'm working on many different projects. I'm involved with Analema Group. I'm working as a solo artist, and suddenly a lot of, so this is what I actually written earlier in the chat. Sometimes you've been doing specific kind of work, and then the context shifts. And so the work becomes something else because the context has shifted, and we can't deny it. We are not living in a vacuum. So at times, and Analema Group has worked together for like more than 10 years now, and we've been working, many of you know the work, we've been working on things really step by step, developing from very small scale based solutions to kind of larger scales, and working with participatory situations, with immersive experiences. And sometimes I feel, depending on where we are in time and space, that work really shifts much more towards political. So for example, the work that we've done with the voice, with highlighting and involving human voice and letting people participate and bring their voice in the middle of the space in a very open, vulnerable, I would say, space. I feel that that really makes kind of the work itself makes a standing in terms of, inviting people to the space that could be vulnerable, but also very powerful, and people can actually exercise that power. And that moment of co-creation, well, what is co-created? We're all basically being responsible for that particular moment, what emerges. And I think that participation comes with a lot of responsibility on the side of the artists, but also on the side of the audiences, who are suddenly stop being audiences, they become participants, at least for, let's say, a specific period of time. And this is, I'm just giving you like one specific example. Another example where I felt that whole idea of context shifting what we're doing and how we're working is, and both Oliver and Ali can, I think, support me on that, is when we were planning our art residency at the National Gallery X, we were actually planning a physical installation, and we did an art residency in, I think it was in winter, in January, and we were planning to go back and install that show to bring all of you in and many more people. And we were kind of constructing that whole narrative, how it is going to happen. And then suddenly we have a situation, and the context is inviting us to step into the space where, well, what do we do? Can we step into a completely virtual space? And what does it do to us as artists? What does it do to the artwork? What does it do to the audience? And whether this is going to enhance the work or make it like more fragile, more difficult to communicate. And then, so I think we're constantly playing with the context that is also shifting very quickly. Yeah, and I mean, of course, I can share much more about how work can be political, but I would kind of keep it right now to what I've shared already, and maybe let Deborah share, because I think she has quite a lot to say.
I just wanted to add, Evgenia, yes. You also mentioned your own work, and I know that currently you're also working on forest. Your Eternal Forest project, for instance, is also political in a very fundamental way, and I think there as well you kind of experienced this change from something that was initially an art piece to something that has really a momentum behind it.
Yeah. The reason why I'm late here is because I was doing my regular Eternal Forest conversations. And we've had actually somebody like a beautiful community-led project from the UK, Global Generation. And before we had another artist who is also part of Culture Declares Emergency. And basically, suddenly, I'm in the midst of all these amazing artists and people who are feeling that maybe their art is just more than art, and it's actually something that is really kind of shifting the goalpost and shifting the boundary. And a lot of artists are sharing with me, and I'm sure you've heard that a lot of artists are asking, well, what is art and who are artists right now? And what is that role seems to be shifting quite a lot. So this is pretty much what I'm waking up, with every day.
Great, thank you. And Deborah, in your context, do you feel that the kind of political dimension in terms of communicating heritage to new audiences, is that something that you're aware of? Also, this idea of kind of longevity of your work and this kind of wider context, is that something that you're quite aware of, or is that secondary to your practice?
So the best way I think to answer this in a sort of hopefully logical way is it's probably secondary, but I think the subject matters, or the interests are political in themselves, right? So if you are looking at sort of extraction within specific communities and what that impacts, I don't think you can take the political out of that sort of discussion. But I think at the same time, someone had said earlier in the live stream that artists often work as translators as well. And there was also another point that was sort of talked about earlier as to what is the intention, right? And I think if you as a practitioner know your intention of what it is that you want to kind of what it is that your work delivers that message for, then that sort of by nature gives it its political or its apolitical dimension, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, yes, the work, the subject matters and the areas of interests are, but I wouldn't, we could have a discussion about the recreation of a yurt, and the ethics around it as well as a sort of political dimension. So, and perhaps being an artist is about opening yourself up to that
role that you're playing in society as well. Absolutely. I think we're nearing the end of the discussion, so I just want to ask a final question to everybody, and it's a bit of a critical one because we talked a lot about the possibilities of new media to create new type of heritage experiences. And I just wanted to be a bit of devil's advocate and ask about the flip side of it, this idea of gamification and, art is something that is only experiential and maybe too much of a gimmick sometimes in the context of new media. So the role that technology plays on the one hand side as a facilitator, but also the danger to use technology for technology's sake. And I think this is a relevant question for everybody, including the researchers and the institutions amongst the panelists. So maybe I can ask this question first to Eike, and then we can go around as a final round.
I mean, talking about gamification, I think that is actually a minefield. It's actually very badly understood topic. I mean, some people think gamification is you take anything, you add a scoring system into the leaderboard, and there you've got your game. It's because there's some publications that mention, it's like as elements of a game is that there's competition and so on, but that's actually not what makes it a game. So actually for gamification, something that is very important to make it effective is the fun aspect of it being a game. So just because there is a score doesn't make it fun, it doesn't make it a game. And there have been lots of arguments about that. Actually, quite seminal is a work from 2005 by Michael Zeder, who's, I think, professor in Southern California, who wrote an article from visual simulation to virtual reality to games, and where he actually argues that when you think about gamification or say serious games, the game and the fun must come first. Anything else, the message that you want to carry with it and so on, should be secondary and should be implicit. I think there is I'll post the link. Anyway, so, and at the moment, right now, probably the most difficult thing is when you talk about gamification and you're creating heritage experiences, virtual heritage, is the audience expectation, because audiences expect the quality of the latest PlayStation title. And that is perfectly possible to achieve, but it's incredibly difficult and expensive. And on the heritage side, you rarely find that. I think actually Assassin's Creed, they have done a whole sub-level that you get, where you then have, you know, the heritage tours within the Assassin's Creed games, where they worked with historians and archaeologists to create that. But that's the closest thing you come to that.
Thank you so much, Eike. Francesca, from your point of view, do you think there is any danger for new media art to sometimes be too tech heavy, or tech being more than just a facilitator, a means to an end? What is your take on this?
I don't know, like for me, it's actually, I don't know. Like I treat media, all the media, in the same way. And again, I'll go back to the intention. So, and also like gamification of what, are we talking about art? Are we talking about documentation? Are we talking about like, it's, I don't know. I think like it's good to be free to experiment, and it's good to artists should be like, if there is a new technology, you know, sometimes you just learn from scratch and you go through like a process of like trying to explore it, and maybe then you lose a bit the intention, but then you will pick it up while you learn something else. So I don't know. I don't know what to say, to be honest.
No, it's a good answer.
I think for me, it's not a risk. I wouldn't treat it as a risk.
Thank you. Maybe let's hear from the practitioners. Evgenia, what is your thought?
So it's a good question. I love it, because I'm always the one who says, well, let's like, what's the meaning behind this artwork? And then Oliver always mirrors me, and sometimes when I don't say that, he says, but what is the message, what is the meaning behind the artwork? We don't want just to make like this gimmicky art where you wave one hand and things happen and that's it. But yes, I would really agree with Eike saying that fun part is really important. Sometimes fun is hidden in the more like contemplative observation or participative aspect, but it has to be some kind of spectrum of fun. For me, I wrote in the chat, for me, this idea of being able to step into the space and something is set up for you, and you have to sometimes figure the rules of the game or the conditions, and sometimes we intentionally hide it from the audience, from the participants. So sometimes it's very straightforward. I don't know if you've seen our work at Tate Exchange, Kim and Noise project, like you have to figure some bits out. Sometimes it's not very obvious. There is this thing in the middle of the touch screen, and you have to draw the sound, and then the sound appears in space, but in the other room, it's not so, it's you enter and you hear, you don't hear, you don't know. It's about pushing and pulling, and sometimes inviting audience to listen, sometimes to give them solutions straight away, sometimes to hide things from them. But for me, it's participation, it's immersion, it's fun, it's play, and it's ritual as well. And I think it's one of the most ancient ways we explore reality. And I think in terms of when being aware of also this circle we are talking within. I think this exploration of levels of consciousness and reality is incredibly important and interesting, especially when we are talking about immersive media art, interactive art, ritualistic art, and I'm aware of many artists present here who are working with this aspect. So for me, they're all viable, but of course, ultimately as an artist, I always want to ask myself, well, okay, what is the message that we are, carrying here, what we're proposing, or what is the question? So for me, it's always like this, this voice in my head, yeah.
Great, thank you. Yeah, with the Deborah and then Ali for the final word, and yeah, we're literally rounding up.
Yeah, I mean, I would probably echo what's been sort of said earlier, and I feel like gamification in the sort of different levels, the different ways that you can approach it is actually quite a good method for someone who is A, trying to learn a technology, and B, also trying to figure out a narrative as well, right? Because it's only through doing then you realize and you go, wow, was I in that sort of dystopic realm, or did I go into this sort of, all the way on the opposite spectrum? And the only way you know is by doing. And I'll just say I lecture part-time at an art university, and very often students want to have these very sort of dark, complicated subjects, but they sort of figure them out through gamification and methods of games to actually go, wow, that's not a good idea at all. So it's you gotta try.
Thank you. Yeah, and Ali, final words from you about this kind of conflict, this ambiguity here.
I think the conflict is a real one, this idea of gimmickry, particularly because a lot of times a new technology comes out and then there's a lot of funding to figure, from companies or universities or governments to say, well, how do we use this? And I speak, from multiple perspectives because I'm a practicing artist. I also have commissioned a lot of works of art and produced a lot of works of art and serve as, creative director in more than one situation. So I don't want to sound dogmatic. These terms are more fluid than they may sound, but I always say art is concept plus craft. And they both need to be carried to the highest level. So you need a high concept, and that concept, it could be a gesture or it could be a narrative. I mean, in my mind, there are really just two kinds of concepts, gestural and narrative. We could probably expand on that. And craft means a high aesthetic, which means actually understanding the medium and taking that medium to applying, an intellectual, practical, and what you might call a manual understanding that medium to the highest level of refinement. So I'm old school in that way. Gimmickry falls out just between those two. You're just doing it, I guess, to really answer your question, I'd say something's a gimmick is you're doing it because you can. Something that's art is you're doing it because you have to, or because you have something to say. So I think it's very close to what Evgenia says is let's not make this if we don't have something to say.
Thank you. Yeah, and I just want to echo what you said earlier, this idea of putting poetry back into technology. I think this is really the essence of what all of you have been saying today. Yeah, thank you so much for all the speakers and contributors today. I think it was an incredible conversation, really important discussion. And I'm just going to hand over to Afra now to tease a little bit of what Art in Flux has in store for you in the next months.
Thank you, Oliver, and thank you so much to all the speakers. Absolutely fantastic event. Absolutely. I won't take up too much time at all. Just to say that there's a really a lovely link with the curated talk I'll be holding at the National Gallery X in November to heritage and what we've been talking about today. So the idea with my event, which will be called Shifting Ground, which will be to use artworks from the National Gallery's collection as a starting point to explore how migrant voices are portrayed within British art history. So we'll be basically exploring how contemporary media artists explore their own cultural heritage or British heritage. And this feels like a really very relevant topic at the moment, exploring other stories within contemporary media art practice. And then also the next Flux Live, which is coming up, is in August, and I'm curating it around audiovisual performance. So we've got 3 artists, Anna Nazo, Mowgli and Mark Pilkington, who will be showcasing performance, and then with Q&As as well. So I really hope you can join us for that on the 18th of August. And thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so much. Thank you again to all the speakers, to our incredible audience. And yeah, we're looking forward to seeing you soon at the next Flux Live. Thank you.